Brittany, before anything else, for hosting this really wonderful event in one of my favorite cities. Thank you so much, Brittany. Very kind. So a lot of content in this book. So this is going to be a very quick overview of some of the things that I address in the book. So just really quickly to give you some context, and I apologize in advance if you know this already, but the war began in World War I began in 1914 and ended in 1918, but the United States didn't declare war until April of 1917. So we were a little late to enter the fray. One of the really major events that brought us closer to the war was this, as shown here on the screen here, the sinking of the passenger liner Lusitania. 126 Americans drowned in the torpedo attack by a German submarine. And this event, even though it took place in 1915, it took two more years before we declared war, this event began to change American public opinion, shifted really from really being ambivalent about who to side with in this war to more on the side of the Allies, the British and the French, and against the Germans. But it still took 2 years. President Wilson, who campaigned on the pledge in 1917, he kept us out of the war, in 1916, and his inauguration was just a few months after that promise that kept us out of war. But war was declared in April of 1917. Okay, one of the people that I came across in researching this book was this guy here, Edgar Bullen, who came from a blue blood family in New Orleans, very a well-known blue blood family, but he was a real rascal. And I wanted to find more and more about him because he deserves a book by himself. But real quickly, he was a real Francophile, and when the United States did not go to war in 1914 with the French, he was angry and ended up joining the French Foreign Legion and then the Lafayette Escadrille, a very famous Air Force that were volunteers, and many of whom were Americans. And he joined and became the very first American casualty of World War I. He was not killed, but he was wounded 3 different times. His plane crashed. And this is way before the United States declaration of war. So he was quite a well-known figure throughout the country. Very famous guy, I'll tell you real quickly. He was a big photographer, and he took pictures from the cockpit. After the war was over, he went to develop some film at this Parisian photo shop, and he met this young French woman there, and 3 weeks later they were married. She spoke no English at all. Anyway, he convinces her somehow, well, he spoke French very fluently. He convinces her to go back to New Orleans, his hometown, and they tried to start a business. It didn't work out well. They had an apartment on Bourbon Street, actually, just a couple of blocks from his parents. Anyway, he started drinking heavily and was abusive to her. And make a long story short, she shot and killed him in their kitchen, when he was abusing, he was physically abusing her, punching her and kicking and such. And she was distraught by it, was sobbing within his body really lying there on the floor, but she was really defending herself. She was never brought to trial or anything like that, but it made headlines all over the country. I read newspapers in Ogden, Utah that had cover stories of his death. Anyway, interesting guy. There's more to it in the book. So one of the things that the war did was help to embellish the Great Migration. And the Great Migration, for those of you who don't remember, was this diaspora of tens of thousands, literally, mostly African Americans that fled mostly the South and mostly agricultural regions of the South to take much more well-paying positions and jobs in northern industrial cities like Philadelphia, Chicago, and Milwaukee. And you can see here, this chart shows you the number of African Americans, well, the population growth in these several cities across the bottom there, and how it just jumped. And this map shows you a little bit of the diaspora there and where they traveled to. There was a huge need for labor and more industries, and this was a ready source of labor. The northern industries, the war industries, were so desperate they actually sent agents down into New Orleans and other places to recruit people and promised to pay their travel expenses for them and their family members, and even located places for them to live, to encourage them to leave their agricultural jobs. So that's one of the real big impacts it had. And of course, another reason that they left was not just because better pay and better jobs, but also because, well, this is just a photo of them in a train station. But another reason they left was, of course, to escape Jim Crow. This is an ad from the New Orleans Times-Picayune in 1918. This is for a clothing store. There is your clothing store. So this is the kind of thing, and this should surprise you. You know this was going on at the turn of the century, or right in the years prior to the war. This is the kind of thing that was commonplace. Nobody thought much of it. But the attitudinal changes were long in coming. So a lot of these folks left New Orleans and other places in the South, not just because of better jobs, but also to escape this. One of the interesting parts of the history of the African American population during the war was the development of a group of people. It was a benevolent society called the Knights of Pythias. And they built this building here. This is what it looks like on the right in color. This is what it is on the left. The Pythian Temple. This was the epicenter of middle-class, educated African Americans in the city of New Orleans. And it was a place of common ground. It had shops there, barber shops. They had insurance agents. They even had a ballroom on the upper floor where a lot of jazz musicians like Louis Armstrong played. And this guy here, Smith Wendell Green, now that's actually his first name, Smith Wendell Green. He was a millionaire during the war from North Louisiana, born into slavery, but because of his entrepreneurial skills, he was able to fund the construction of this Pythian Temple. And what's interesting so much about this war, the African American population was targeted by the Germans because they thought that this was an area that they could make inroads in, that these were vulnerable to German propaganda. Don't fight for your country, come fight for us, or at the very least, don't resist the German offensives during the war. And so the middle-class African Americans in New Orleans, led by this man Green, they actually tried to profess their loyalty to the war and their devotion to Woodrow Wilson and the war effort. And they did that because this is what they were looking for, is Negro uplift, hoping that by displaying their loyalty to Woodrow Wilson and displaying patriotism, they conducted their own ceremonies and rallies to support the war. The hope was that this would elevate them in the eyes of the white population and maybe mitigate somewhat the constraints of Jim Crow. Of course, that didn't work, but that was their motivations. Negro uplift, that's what it was called. Now, the African-American soldiers in the war did not really participate in combat much. There were a few units they did, but for the most part, they ended up doing work much like they had been used to doing when they were back in the States. They did loading trucks, unloading trains, stevedore work, that kind of thing. But one of the unique features of the New Orleans African-American population was they participated in orchestras, military orchestras, but also ad hoc jazz groups, because jazz is just coming now on the scene, and after hours they would play little combos that get together. There were 3 or 4 New Orleanians particularly that got together and formed these groups, and they played, and the French loved it. This was the first introduction that the French had to American jazz. There was a New Orleanian by the name of Nickerson who actually published 2 very popular patriotic songs that were popular throughout the country. One of them was the Colored Soldier Boys of Uncle Sam, We're Coming, and it was really, really popular all over the country. So that was a contribution that they made that did not really enter into play with the white population. There you go. So this is just an ad for a jazz combo, the exploitation of jazz. Another impact that the war had was on the Prohibition. So the dries and the wets were really at odds. When the war comes, however, it's going to give impetus to the dries. It really accelerates the Prohibition movement tremendously. Now, how did that happen? Well, they were very clever, the dries were, because what they did, they associated the Prohibition movement with patriotism. So there was a connection between Germany and beer. I mean, there were 13 different breweries, for example, in New Orleans, and this was true in a lot of cities, and almost all of them had German names and were owned by Germans. So it was easy to associate Germany with beer and alcohol, and so it became almost unpatriotic, not almost, it became unpatriotic not to support the Prohibition movement. And so that helped them in achieving their goals. So you can see some of these propaganda ads that the dries were famous for, and you can see how John Morley corn, representing alcohol, is next to the 2 enemies during the war, the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians. This is what alcohol does. Look, see, it shows you alcohol is an artillery piece. Not in the peace treaties, still your enemy. So you can see this arm grabbing this American doughboy here, and on the forearm is written booze. You see that? So this was really clever. So it really made it almost impossible for somebody to outwardly denounce the Prohibition movement. Look at this, more of the same. Here's one, vote dry for us. They're kids in the photograph. How do you vote against that? So that association was really difficult to compete with. And a couple of more, huh? The saloon backers are traitor to his country. Will you back me or booze? There you go, there's the choice. One or the other. Backing the soldiers or backing booze. So I think you can understand what's going to happen. So even in Louisiana, the amendment passed eventually. This is I'll pull this out of the newspaper, the Times speaking in August of 1918, but I love this. So they finally passed the approval of the amendment in the legislature. This is the state legislature in Baton Rouge. And this gentleman, Mr. Evans, who was a rep, he shouted out, "Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to let the House take a recess in order to give the Prohibitionists time in which to get tight and celebrate their victory." So let them go out and booze it up because they just won. They just passed it. So another amendment that was really nourished by World War I was the Women's Suffrage Amendment. So both of these amendments, the Prohibition and the Women's Suffrage Amendment, really had their origins way back into the 19th century. But guess what? World War I is going to really bring both of them to success. So, as you know, women participated in the war in non-combat roles. So we all know about Rosie the Riveter, that famous iconic image that we know. We associate the women that worked in war industries in World War II. There were Rosies in World War I just as well. And interesting to see the kinds of things that they did. They drove automobiles around They learned auto mechanics. In fact, the old Roosevelt Hotel, if you know the city at all, the old Roosevelt Hotel on Verona Street, in the basement they actually had a mechanics shop that was designed for women who wanted to learn how to change the oil and fix the brakes, whatever, and the instructor was a woman. So this was really a big step forward for women. They drove streetcars. They became clerks in men's clothing stores, ushers in theaters, which had always been males only, and even elevator operators. Oh my God, women operating elevators. It's hard to believe. There you go. So a couple of, you know the story, it's quite a compelling story, the women's suffrage movement in the city. And it was more than just nurses. They did lots of other things as well, including becoming hello girls. On the upper right photo there, you'll see they were recruited to operate telephone lines in France, and the women that spoke French were recruited so that could help the military in communication with their French allies. You can see them here on the right bottom working on a car. Now this lady here, Kate Gordon, was the tip of the spear in the women's suffrage movement in Louisiana. She was a native of New Orleans. She was an amazing woman. She was an indefatigable voice for progressive change. They called her a soft, they called them all softs. So she was a big advocate of the suffrage movement, all kinds of things that she promoted, including lobbied in Baton Rouge personally for the first female applicant to Tulane University's medical school. And she was able to succeed in getting that lady entered into the first class there. She was, however, must add this, an unapologetic racist. Absolutely. So she was in favor of the suffrage amendment, but for white women. For white women. So actually, she was against the national suffrage amendment. She wanted an amendment, a suffrage amendment passed in Louisiana. And so that's one of the darker sides of her. But quite a lady, never married, her whole life embraced just these kinds of progressive movements. This lady here was an ally of her, Florence Huber Wall, excuse me, and she was really an interesting woman. She was actually a voice instructor in town, but she was very much a dyed-in-the-wool suffragette. And she would position herself on busy Canal Street, very pedestrian heavy. And I'm going to just read to you a little bit from the book about her. She would stop men as they walked up and down the street, and she would point her finger at them and say, "Stop, I have something to say to you." And she was very bold. Soon they found themselves listening and often laughing at what she had to say. The newspaper, the New Orleans Item, described Huber Wall's style as straight from the shoulder and brief, practiced as she was in the art of proletariat street oratory. So she would say, "Will Louisiana be a volunteer or wait to become a conscript through national suffrage? How long will the United States, the divine trumpeter of freedom, blush at the tardy acknowledgement of justice to her women?" You couldn't take your eyes off of her. And no anecdote existed to tame her. Finally, with a rising shout that resonated above the din of the streetcars and newsboys, she swirled to the men who surrounded her, jabbing her finger in their face and challenging them eye to eye. "Men of Louisiana, what are you going to do?" So she was quite a woman, and eventually, of course, the amendment will succeed in passing. Another element that I talk about a good deal in the book is Germanophobia, anti-German hysteria that swept through really every place in this country, but certainly in New Orleans. New Orleans is the second largest ethnic group in New Orleans at that time was German. There were 16,000 native-born Germans living in the city. That's not counting those that had German ancestry. So it was a significant German population, but they really were vilified throughout the war like they were in many places. So a lot of commercial establishments that had German in their name had to change them. And I have a couple of examples here. Even churches changed their names. And there was a weekly syndicated column in the Times-Picayune by this guy, Robert Bowman. And he called, he didn't pull much in the way of punches. He called German aliens the scum of the melting pot, poisoning America. They are serpents in our bosom. So all he did was inflame that movement against the German population even more than it needed to be. And look at this. This is the cover of Life magazine in May of 1916. Look at that. Talk about help to inflame the American public against Germany. Can you read that? New Prussia? Look at New Orleans. That is renamed New Hamburg. Every other place. And my favorite is Chicago. You see Chicago, Schwarthouse. Appropriate. So again, this was a cover of Life magazine. This was not very nuanced, is it? This is, be aware of the German threat. And, these kinds of propaganda posters were everywhere. Read back to Han, you can look at his fingers, they're bloody. A lot of times they were depicted as beasts carrying away innocent women. And the idea was to promote enlistments in the military, to create that fervor. And another, look at this, a silhouette of this German Han, of course, the infamous rape of Belgium depicts that. Keep the Han out, buy home protection with war saving span. So that was another campaign that was going on as well. And then movies out of Hollywood were created. These are just two. To hell with the Kaiser, pretty unambiguous there, right? And then the Kaiser, the Beast of Berlin. This one in particular was playing at the Tudor Theater of Canal Street in New Orleans. And during its run, the theater erected a gallows with the Kaiser's effigy hanging right there on the sidewalk. Just outrageous. But again, this was all during the war, this anti-German hysteria. Even some of you may know the old Cats and Jammer Kids cartoon strip in the newspapers. Oh, we can't have that. That's too Germanic. So they changed Hans and Fritz, the two kids, to Mike and Alec. Can't have German names in our newspapers. Oh my God, no. And then there was a street in New Orleans. I say was. There was a street in uptown New Orleans called Berlin Street. Of course, it's appropriate. Obvious New Orleans dysfunction, but Berlin Street. Well, oh my gosh, so the letters to the city council were overwhelming. We can't have a street named Berlin. Now, I don't know what you know about that area of town, but there are a series of streets in uptown New Orleans that are all named after Napoleon's victories over the Germans in the Franco-Prussian War and in the Napoleonic War. Austerlitz and Marengo and Berlin is just one of them because Napoleon captured Berlin as well. So they were done in tribute to French victories over Germany. But that didn't matter. The street was named Berlin Street. Let's change it. So the city council changed the name of the street. And it was changed to General Pershing Street. And General Pershing was, of course, the commander of the American Expeditionary Force in France during World War I. And it's still named General Pershing Street today. So this cultural genocide was true in New Orleans as well as everywhere else. So you can see the German language stopped being spoken in the schools. They were outlawed taught, the German textbooks in German. German was as commonly taught throughout the public schools in New Orleans as Spanish is today, or French is today. So it was very, very common to have a German language teacher, even in elementary schools. No more, not during World War I. I talked to this lady who remembers as a child her grandmother, who was born in Germany. She remembers that her grandparents spoke German at home, but they whispered when she was around, because she knew she was afraid that someone outside the house might hear them speaking German. That's how paranoid a lot of these folks were, because of the insanity surrounding them. So there's an editorial in the Times-Picayune. You can see the German language is being kicked out of public schools. As a consequence to this Germanophobia, the United States government, the Justice Department in particular, sanctioned the creation of a vigilante organization. And I say that because that's exactly what it was. It was a civilian adjunct to the FBI, or as they called it then, the Bureau of Intelligence. So the predecessor of the FBI, the Bureau of Intelligence. Very, very thinly populated. They didn't have very many people working there, but the government decided, okay, there are spies everywhere, the German spies everywhere, we need help. And so the Justice Department created an organization called the American Protective League, euphemistically called the American Protective League, who were, for 50 cents, you were given a badge, you filled out a very simple application, it took you less than a minute, and you became an agent to assist the FBI in ferreting out any kind of German or harpooning German spies that might be around the country. It turns out there were almost none at all, but they went after other targets. This is one example of the kinds of things that they did. They wrote reports on anyone that was suspected of being unpatriotic. That's what it morphed into. Identifying anyone unpatriotic. This is just one that I found in the Tulane archives there. And this was the phrase that raised attention. Germany had given the world so much in literature, science, music, the greatest race in the world. So this was overheard at Hotel T. And someone overheard this person saying it, reported it, and the APL picked him up for questioning. That's it, just because he mentioned that they were the greatest race in the world. This is another report that I found. This is from San Francisco division, but New Orleans had a population of about 2,400 APL agents throughout the course of the war. Most of them older men that were too old to serve in the military, so they were well-meaning, but they violated civil liberties daily. But anyway, this particular guy, he was on a train, and he asked the waiter in the dining car for another helping of sugar. Well, sugar was rationed, and he complained about the ration. He made several nasty remarks about food restrictions. Well, someone overheard him, and as he stepped off the train, he was brought in for questioning because he didn't like being restricted in his sugar. It's crazy stuff. So this cartoon pretty much encapsulates what I just said. So they raids on homes, no warrants at all, blatantly illegal searches, opening safes. Even the Attorney General, Thomas Gregory, he excused such illegalities by saying, these are zealous members that were led into the streets of authority by excess of zeal for the public good. So it's all good because it's done for good purposes. So yeah, we're violating civil liberties, but we're going to suspend those because of the threat that Germany imposes on the United States during the war. Loyalty oaths were required throughout the city. Even Tulane University's faculty was required to sign a loyalty oath, and if they did not, they were let go. As simple as that. There was one gentleman, I have his letter, petition in my appendix here, but he had taught at Tulane for 25 plus years, biology teacher, but he had a German last name, but he refused to sign this loyalty oath. He thought that was a violation of his own personal opinions, his own rights. And so they were going to fire him. Well, he asked to speak to the Board of Trustees, basically the school board for the school, to really demonstrate his loyalty. His wife was a member of the American Red Cross. He had a nephew in the AEF fighting overseas, and he asked really for them to at least give him a chance to speak for himself. They refused in a unanimous vote. So he wasn't even allowed to show his side of the story. George Mayer was his name. The mayor of New Orleans was this guy here. I spent a good deal talking about him. He was a very, very well-liked mayor, elected 5 different times. He died in his 5th term, but he was in office for 16 years in the city. And even though New Orleans was handcuffed with Jim Crow, Berman paid a great deal of tribute to the African-American population that was uniformed and drafted into the military. And there were great parades the days that these troops were sent to the railroad station so that they could be brought to the first training camp. And the African-American soldiers were brought to the train stations on different days from the white soldiers. But on that day, Bourbon actually declared Afro-American Day in New Orleans and stood outside City Hall as they marched by, paying tribute to all of the soldiers, or about to be soldiers, that were marching to the train stations. So I looked and I could not find any other city, even in the North, anywhere else, outside of the parameters of Jim Crow, that paid such a tribute to the African Americans, that soldiers, or soon-to-be soldiers, that were going overseas. So he was really a progressive in many ways. So this is just a picture of one of the many parades on Canal Street, and even brought in a British tank to travel down the street to attract attention, because this was all done to raise money for war bonds, for the war. Another important story that I cover is the story of, some of you know, the legalized prostitution district in New Orleans called Storyville. So Storyville was just outside the French Quarter, the Vieux Carré, and it was in place for 20 years. And it was established as a legal there was a legal perimeter that allowed prostitution inside of that perimeter. Actually, the wording of the city ordinance did not exactly legalize prostitution. It simply said that it's illegal anywhere else outside that district. So it was a way of kind of finessing the legalization of that. This became a problem for the War Department during the war, because a lot of our young men like to participate in the services provided in Storyville. And they came from various places, even in Mississippi, in South Mississippi, Camp Shelby, Hattiesburg. There was a ton of them. Would jump on the train, and they would immediately go to Storyville. That became a problem for the War Department, so they threatened to close it. Well, Mayor Berman knew that this Storyville area was an economic engine for the city. There were thousands of people that came in, not just during the war, but since its inception in 1896. And anyway, so it's interesting the way it was set up. I'll show you this. The Southern Railroad Terminal, I'll show you right here, was right at the beginning of the major street of Storyville, which is Basin Street. So Basin Street was the Champs-Élysées of Storyville. That's where the real high-class brothels were located. Well, the trains, of course, as they got closer to the station, they were slow. And a lot of the young ladies would stand in the windows and pantomime certain sexual acts that would entice these folks as they came in. Not that they needed enticement, but as they stepped off the train, they were sold these blue books. Some of you might know what the blue books were. That was really a directory of the brothels in Storyville with short descriptions of the services provided and photos of some of the women. And so right as they stepped off the train, that was it. Boom, for 25 cents they'd get a blue book. Well, anyway, so the soldiers were flooding Storyville, and this was the War Department now was saying that no brothel can operate, or liquor establishment can operate within a 10-mile radius of a military installation. And there were several in New Orleans. So Berman trains up to Washington, D.C., and argues that, oh, we've got it all set up. We've got police patrolling. If anybody looks like they're in the military, if they have uniforms, we are not letting them in. Let us maintain Storyville. And he agreed to it. He said, okay, let's wait and see. He was Newton Baker was a former mayor of Cleveland himself, so he sympathized with Mayor Berman. Anyway, so what was happening, though, that the soldiers from Camp Shelby and elsewhere would take off their uniforms, and the taxi drivers would rent them civilian clothes. And they would go in. And they also, of course, let them know where the nearest liquor establishments were and so on and so forth. So it didn't work, so eventually Storyville was closed. But Storyville comes into play. This is just a couple of photos. It's all destroyed now. But the interesting thing about Storyville, which distinguishes it from other brothels throughout the country, was that it was, as I have here, racially heterogeneous. So one of the attractions of several of these brothels was that we had women that were of mixed race. Now, the city ordinance very, very respectfully referred to these women, and I have it in quotes, women notoriously abandoned to lewdness. And I just love that wording of it, because it doesn't really assign blame to the women, does it? They were abandoned to lewdness, so it's not their fault. So this was one of the attractions, and then in the midst of Jim Crow segregation in New Orleans, this really flew in the face of Jim Crow because of this racial mixing. I am running short of time, but I want to read one more thing to you that I think is funny. And I should have read this earlier when we talked about jazz and how jazz was first accepted or not in New Orleans and elsewhere. So in the Picayune, the New Orleans major newspaper, editorial in 1917 talked about, I'll just read a portion of it, that it was a musical form that it was, quote, down in the basement, a servant's hall of rhythm. The author could not understand how its cult of acolytes loved to wallow in noise, talking about jazz, okay? A lot of folks feared the enchantment that dancing to jazz had for their children and its ability to overreach racial boundaries because it appealed to both races. Jazz was insolent. That was a large part of its appeal. Its revolutionary message crossed Jim Crow perimeters, fascinating young and urbane whites to a musical species that evolved from the bowels of the African-American experience. Women were, quote, testing the limits of social acceptability through their bodies, as one author said. And it brought couples together in sexually explicit arrangements. And helped mark the advent of sexual liberation. Getting sweaty and dancing with partners of the opposite sex became morally tricky. So the critics believe that these new primitive sounds encouraged racial mixing, a kind of musical miscegenation. Interesting, isn't it? So it really did cross those racial boundaries. And when I wrote this, it reminded me very much of the Elvis Presley story. What happened, you know the story of Elvis. In the early days, how his music was not even allowed on certain radio programs. And on the famous Ed Sullivan show, when he was on for the very first time, when the cameras showed him from waist up. You know that story. Because it seemed too lewd as he swiveled his hips to be on national television. So this kind of reminded me of that. It was a revolutionary kind of musical genre, and a lot of folks were just not ready for it. Anyhow, the very last slide that I have is that one of the things that we were proud of in the city is that we were the first city in New Orleans to erect a monument in tribute to the soldiers that from New Orleans that participated in sailors in World War I. And you can see that on each of the standards there are plaques. The sad thing is that they are segregated racially. So only the white participants are on one plaque and the black participants are on the other. So there's a kind of a historic piece there that reminds us about what Jim Crow was like. Thank you so much for your attention. And if you have questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them. Yes?
Interesting that you finished with that monument. I just was wondering if you're aware of what happened in Natchez, Adams County with regard to their celebration. They had, you can study the process of it at the NAPAC Museum. But when they put up their plaque for honoring the World War I, they excluded all the blacks, and that was finally rectified, maybe some people could correct me, about 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So all the way until then, they were kept out, and there was so anyway, there's a big process that was involved in changing that. I just thought,
thank you for that. I'm not surprised.
They were much more innovative.
Yeah, in New Orleans, in many ways, was Jim Crow light. And there are other examples of that I go into in the book, but it wasn't as rigid as a lot of other cities. And the one thing that I did mention to you was that Afro-American Day, which was a tribute that I didn't see anywhere else happening in the South.
So, you know, in Natchez, we like to call ourselves the Little Easy after New Orleans. How much of what you talk about do you feel like is also applicable to Natchez at the time? If you can answer that question.
You know, I think, you know, the ugliness of Jim Crow was pretty much universal throughout the South. But, you know, I always remind folks, because I talk about this a lot in my classes and adults and young people as well, that Jim Crow was not just exclusively Southern, that there was de jure segregation and there was de facto segregation. So in the South, we had de jure segregation where there was actually laws passed that made it impossible for blacks and whites to integrate. But in northern cities, throughout the North, there was de facto segregation. So there was segregation, but there was no law restricting it. But the races were certainly segregated. There are over and over again examples. I've read diary accounts of New Orleanians fleeing the city during the war to take jobs in the North, in Chicago in particular I'm thinking of, and they felt uneasy sitting anywhere in the bus because all of the African Americans were in the back. There was no law there. That's just the way it was. So it was really, unfortunately, all over the United States. Any other questions about anything?
Where is that?
Yes, ma'am.
That monument?
It's in the 9th Ward. I don't know how much you know about New Orleans, but I can tell you exactly where it is, but it probably wouldn't do you much good. But it's down the river from the French Quarter. It's in a residential neighborhood. It was erected, it was funded by the people living in that neighborhood, actually, just by private donations. Yes, ma'am.
So where in the Ninth Ward?
If you know where the old Nichols High School is located, it's now called Frederick Douglass High School. It's the street just behind the playground, behind the school.
So it survived?
Oh, yeah, it survived, yeah. Mhm. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
The people that were picked up for saying something wrong and reported.
Yeah, the APL.
And then, so what was their punishment, or what happened to those people?
Well, that's a good question. They were supposed to turn in their badges, and they would flash their badge. They get in. They got free tickets to the French Opera House. They had free streetcar rides. But what happened? They were supposed to turn their badges in once the war was over. In fact, in February of 1919. But a lot of them did not, and they abused the badge. Because if you look at the photo here, it looks very much like a police badge. And people, you're not going to dispute it, so you flash that badge. So a lot of them participated in what we call the Red Scare of the 1920s, which, if you don't know, was a terrible period in the early 20s when the Ku Klux Klan experienced the resurrection, and white middle-class Americans supported them. 10,000 of them marched down Pennsylvania Avenue. So the Red Scare was about anti-Bolsheviks, because this is right after the Russian Revolution, and there was a fear that Bolshevism was going to take over the country. So these folks participated in those witch hunts against Roman Catholics, Jews, African Americans, of course, but they weren't as much targeted by the Red Scare as the Bolsheviks, labor unions, those folks. Anybody that they thought was un-American, in their definition of what American was.
I think we have time for one more. You're good? One more?
We have this lady here.
Again, thank you for being here. You're obviously very versed in this topic. My question to you is, was there anything that surprised you as you were researching all of this, that surprised you?
Yeah, that's a good question. Plenty of things. Pretty much the extent and the deep-founded hatred for the German population. That I think that I knew that it existed, but I didn't know to the extent where names were changed, even personal names. In certain parts of the country where there's a really big German population, like Milwaukee, for example, where people change their last names to sound more Anglified. But I guess that shocked me and disappointed me. But again, you have to understand that the time that they lived in, it was the furor against the Germans was really the government accelerated that furor by its public statements and by things like the Life magazine photograph, where the United States was taken over by Germans and renamed. So all those, that was a profound surprise to me.
All right, Brian Altobello, everyone.
Thank you very much.
I'm sure you may have some more questions. He will be signing his book at noon out in our author signing table, so make sure you head out there and purchase his book and get it signed. We have about 5 minutes, and we're going to segue into Native American code talking with Dr. Bill Meadows. So, run to the restroom, go buy a book, come back here in just a couple of minutes.
Oh, okay. Okay, sure. As soon as my knees will let me stand up. first time.
Could you tell Billy which one?
Where's
Got
the
it.
go? There's identification problems. I got you. There's the drive right there. Right there. Make it bigger. Code C45. Code T45.
Actually, it's hers, so thank you. We're all together.
So you want to go back to that? Yes, sir. Okay, that one right there. Copy two. Copy two. All right. Let me drag it out to my phone. Yeah, my long distance is okay with my No, I'll probably just cut it once. Okay. Right, well, let me throw it up there right quick. And that's it.
That's it?
Okay.
Perfect, thank you, sir.
That's awesome. And your clicker is on the podium.
Okay.
That mic on the podium is live all the time. If you want to take a handheld, walk around, just snap it out of that post there, you can walk around.